In chapter 16, we're going to be learning the present active indicative part of the Greek verbal system. Now, if you find that you have troubles conceptually in chapter 16, you need to go back to chapter 15. In chapter 15, I try to cover all the conceptual issues relating to verbs. And if you get into chapter 16 and you're having problems, you'll need to go back and look at chapter 15. But if you have the concepts down in chapter 15, then chapter 16 is not that hard. It's pretty much straightforward. But we're going to be learning the present active indicative. So what that means in terms of time is that we're going to be learning how to express something in present time. In terms of voice, it means that we're going to be learning the active, how to form a Greek verb where the subject is doing the action of the verb. And in terms of mood, these are all indicatives. And again, we've agreed not to worry about what that means until the later chapter. So, present active indicative. Or to say it another way, you're going to be learning how to say I say or I am saying, okay, in English, present active indicative forms, okay? In terms of Greek grammar, there's two things I want to emphasize. In the book, I'm describing time. I say that a Greek verb in the present tense describes an action that usually occurs in the present time. That's really an important qualification, okay? Most present tense verbs in Greek do express action occurring at the present time, but they don't always. In fact, sometimes you're going to find later on that present tense verbs can describe actions in the past or describe actions in the future. Remember, in Greek, time isn't primary, aspect is primary. And so they let the tenses kind of float, in the different tense forms float through some of the different time frames. But the present tense form of a verb describes an action that usually occurs at present time, okay? And then there's the whole issue of aspect, okay? We have undefined and we have continuous. So an undefined version of the word would be like I say, and a continuous would be I am saying, all right? Here's the thing in the present tense system. Present tense forms of Greek verbs can be either undefined or continuous. In other words, lego can mean I say or I am saying. You go, well, how do I know which one to use? Well, language learning is both science and art, right? And part of the art is developing a contextual feel for the verse. And that's the clue. Context will be the clue. You'll come along and, for example, you'll translate it with the undefined I say, and you go, oh, that doesn't fit. Oh, I am saying really does fit. So the same actual form of the Greek verb can be both continuous and undefined. And in my paradigms, I tend to give the continuous translation. So lego would be I am saying. But check with your teacher if he or she has a preference for you to use by default the undefined or the continuous, okay? But that's what's going on in Greek, that in terms of time, a present active indicative verb describes an action that usually occurs in present time. And in terms of aspect, a present tense form of a verb can either be undefined or it can be continuous, and you have to look at context to decide which is which. Now, the next paradigm, or the next chart that I'm going to show you is critical. And in fact, what I've done is that I've reduced the Greek verbal system down to two basic charts. And at the beginning of every chapter, I'm going to give you part of one of those charts. The whole chart is called the master verb list, master verb chart. And in each chapter, I'm going to give you just a little bit of it, okay? The whole chart's about a page long. It's in the appendix if you want to take a look at it. I'm not sure I would recommend it right now because it might freak you out. But in each chapter, I'm going to give you just a little piece of that master verb chart. These charts are absolutely crucial for you to know, because this is how you're not going to memorize 950 paradigm forms for every verb, okay? It's been a while since I counted them all up, but it's about that many. In other words, any verb in Greek can occur in about 950 different forms. That's one really big chart, right? In fact, some people sell the chart and it's like 2 by 3 feet with a little itty bitty print. And I mean, it's a cool chart, but it's terrifying for a first year student to look at. Well, you can either memorize all of those forms, or you can learn the two charts that I'm going to give you. Because what the two charts do, and this is much like what I do with nouns, but what the two verbal charts do is give you all the triggers. They tell you how the Greek's verbal system actually constructs its different forms. And it's those pieces that form the triggers that when you see the triggers, you go, oh, that's a present active, or that's a future passive, or something. So the charts highlight how Greek puts the verbs together, and it gives you the triggers to use to identify them. So it's those two charts, or it's these gargantuan paradigms. I think most people prefer my two charts. Well, take a look at the first chart. How do you form the present active indicative? Well, it's formed by using the present tense stem, and then to it you add a connecting vowel, and to it you add primary active personal endings. Now, I know that doesn't mean anything to you right now, but let me just walk you through the process. The verb lego means I say. The present tense stem is leg. To that you add a connecting vowel. It's either going to be omicron or epsilon. And then you add primary active personal endings, which if you want to say you plural for the present active, it's te. So you have the leg and the and the te. And so legate means you all say. The connecting vowel is in there to help pronunciation. It's hard to say leg te, and that pause is that hiatus the Greeks want to avoid. So they put a connecting vowel in there to help you pronounce it. So that is a phenomenally important chart, okay? And it's going to, like I say, a chart like that's going to be at the beginning and sometimes in the middle of every chapter for quite a few more chapters as we work through the verbal system in Greek. But let's talk about the different pieces of it, okay? Let's talk about, first of all, the stem. What's the stem? The stem of a verb is the most basic form of a verb in a particular tense. Now, since we don't know any other tenses, that's not going to mean a whole lot to you right now. But you need to think of it in those terms. The stem of a verb is the most basic form of that verb in a particular tense. And so in the vocabulary section, I will give you the lexical form, which is the first person singular, present indicative, so like Lego. I'm going to give you the definition. It means I say. And then I'm going to give you, it's technically the verb's root, but you don't know what that is yet. So just think of it for now in terms of the present tense stem. There'll be an asterisk, and then there'll be the actual present tense stem. And you need to memorize both the lexical form of the verb, I say, and then you need to memorize the root, the present tense stem, okay? That's going to be very crucial because that's what we use to create the present active indicative, okay? So the present active indicative starts with the present tense stem, and then to that you add a connecting vowel. And again, this is just for pronunciation. And the connecting vowels are going to be either omicron or epsilon. And here's the rule. If the personal ending begins with a mu or a nu, the connecting vowel is going to be an omicron. So, for example, the first person plural personal ending is men. That's how we say we, right? So if you wanted to say we say, it'd be leg a men. That'd be an omicron because men is the personal ending. If the personal ending begins with any other letter other than mu or nu, then the connecting vowel is an epsilon. All right. So the second person plural personal ending is te, tau epsilon. So if you wanted to say you all say, it's legete. Okay. So connecting vowel is omicron or epsilon. The personal ending begins with a mu or a nu. The connecting vowel is an omicron. If it's anything else, it's going to be an epsilon. All right? All right. To the connecting vowel is then added a personal ending. And we've seen a lot of this already with Amy, so this should be largely review. The personal endings are there because the verb has to agree with its subject in person and number. So if the subject is first, second, or third person, then the verb has to have a first, second, or third person personal ending to agree. If the subject is singular or plural, then you have to have singular or plural personal endings on the verb so the verb can agree with the subject. So in other words, in the present active indicative, you're going to have 6 different personal endings. Okay, first, second, third person, both singular and plural. And as I've said in earlier chapters, you don't really have to have an express subject for a verb because the verb in its personal ending contains a reference to its own subject. but it's nice to use to make sure you've got the right subject with the right verb. In other words, if you're reading along and you have anthropos and you think that's the subject of the sentence, and then you get to the verb and the verb is legate, it's a second person personal ending, you go, well, anthropos cannot be the subject of legate because anthropos is third person, legate is second. So the personal endings are there to agree with their subjects and to act as a check and balance in translation. But let's take a look at this chart and put some of this stuff in context before we get much further into the system. I lay out my paradigms, first, second, and third person singular, first, second, and third person plural. It's very normal. And then the next column is going to be the actual form of the verb. Luo means I am loosing. You'll see I'm using the continuous form. I could also say I loose. Lu is kind of a funny little word. We use it because it's short and it's very regular. It's the word for breaking the Sabbath and different things, but we use the word loose as a translation. So luo means I am loosing. Lues, second person singular, is you are loosing. Lue, he, she, it is loosing, and then down into the plural. The next column obviously is the translation of the inflected form. The next column lists the actual connecting vowels that are being used. And the far right column are the true personal endings. Now, we're somewhat in the same situation that we were with nouns, is that there are true case endings, and then those case endings sometimes get modified when you put them onto an actual word. And I wanted you to learn the true case endings, and you saw why when we got to the third declension. Somewhat the same situation with personal endings. I really want you to know what the true personal endings are, okay? It's not going to make a lot of difference right now. It's a little something extra to memorize. But as we get further into the verbal system, and especially when we get out of the indicative part of the verbal system, if you know what the true personal endings are, it gets much, much easier. So this is one of those situations where you'll learn a little more up front, but on down the line it's going to get very, very easy, okay? So what I want you to learn is actually two things. I want you to learn what the true personal endings are. And for the primary active, the true endings are nothing, sigma, iota, men, te, nsi. Okay? It's really important that you memorize those true endings. But then I also want you to memorize what happens when those personal endings are connected to the connecting vowel. And if you look at the part of the paradigm that's in color, you can see that in some cases there's been some significant changes, right? And so I want you to memorize o, ace, a, amen, eta, usi, and again, there could be a new movable in the third person plural form. In other words, in the first person singular, there's no personal ending, and the connecting vowel is lengthened to an omega. In the second person singular, the epsilon has lengthened to the diphthong epsilon iota. Then luo, luomen, luater, straightforward. And in the third person plural, what's happened is the nu has dropped out, and the omicron has lengthened to the diphthong u. Now that's quite a bit to learn, at least at this point. And if it weren't so important later on, I wouldn't want to emphasize this, but it really does get important later on, okay? So what I want you to learn are the true personal endings, okay? Nothing, sigma, iota, men, te, nsi. And then I want you to memorize what they look like with their connecting vowels. O, ace, a, amen, eta, usi. And some people like a little more context, and you may want to memorize them with luo. And so you memorize luo, lues, lue, luomen, luete, luusi. All right? So that's how the paradigm works, and that's what you need to be memorizing. Okay, let's get a little more into detail on what I mean by primary active. Okay? The first chart you're going to learn is the master verb chart. The second paradigm you're going to be learning is the master personal ending chart. Okay, and there are 4 quadrants in this chart, and we've learned the top left-hand corner, the primary active. But there's 6 personal endings in each quadrant for a total of 24 endings. The left column are primary tenses. The right-hand column are secondary tenses. You don't know what that is right now, so not a big deal. The top row are your active forms. Your bottom row are your passive forms. So there's a total of 24 forms that you're going to be memorizing. And so far, we now know the top quadrant, the top left quadrant, the 24 forms. And what are they? They are nothing, sigma, iota, men, te, nsi, and then o, ace, a, amen, eta, usi, or luo, lue, slue, luamen, luete, lu, usi. Well, that's it for the primary active personal endings. That's it for the present active indicative part of the verbal system, at least that we need to know so far. And I think if you understand chapter 15, chapter 16 is pretty straightforward. If you're stuck a bit on chapter 16, if it's a conceptual thing, you may need to go back and review chapter 15. But for most people, chapter 16 is pretty much straightforward. But before we get to the end of the chapter, I need to say something about personal pronouns occurring in the nominative. Now, I've mentioned this in earlier chapters, but it's going to come up in this chapter in the workbook, and I need to make sure that it's pretty clear. Because verbs have personal endings, they don't need expressed pronouns as subjects. In other words, they can say I, you, he, she, it, they, we. They can say all those things in the personal ending, so they don't need expressed pronouns in the nominative. But when you find a pronoun in the nominative, usually what's going on is there's a little bit of emphasis being placed on something. And that's what I wanted to cover. Now, I'm not talking, these are not huge exegetical issues. Again, these are issues of nuance, of slight emphasis, okay? So don't build any great exegetical camps on the presence or the absence of personal pronouns in the nominative. But when you have a personal pronoun in the nominative, one of three things is normally going on. Number one is that there's probably some emphasis being placed. In other words, if I wanted to say, I love Robin, and Robin's not a Greek word, but it is my wife's name, so if I wanted to say, I love Robin, I could say, agapo Robin, and it means I love Robin. But if I wanted to say, I love Robin, I would probably say, ego agapo Robin. In other words, the ego, the first person pronoun, is there for just a little bit of extra emphasis, a little bit of push. So when you find personal pronouns in the nominative, there's generally some kind of emphasis going on. Again, but a nuanced emphasis. The second reason that the Greeks would expressly put a personal pronoun in the nominative is to indicate contrast. And again, maybe this is the kind of emphasis. But if you were going to say something like, not as I will, but as you will. See, not as I, but as you. Greeks will often use personal pronouns in that kind of situation in order to provide an emphatic contrast to what you're saying, okay? The third reason is not very frequent, but I just need to mention in passing. If you have a verb that is third person singular and you want to differentiate gender in the subject, you could have autos or alte or alta for the he, she, it. And the use of autos would differentiate gender where the third person singular form of the verb doesn't. So if you had, for example, lege, is it he says, she says, or it says? Well, you could indicate gender by including a form of autos. Okay, but that's personal pronouns in the nominative, mostly for emphasis, sometimes by way of contrast. Okay, very good. Now let's go ahead and look at what we've learned in this chapter in summary. Well, we've learned the present active indicative. And by present, we're talking about actions that usually occur in present time. By active, we mean that the subject is doing the action of the verb. And by indicative, we're talking about mood and everything's indicative for the time being. How do you form a present active indicative? Well, you form it by taking the present tense stem of the word, which is indicated in the vocabulary with the asterisk. And then to that, you add a connecting vowel. And to that, you add primary active personal endings. And we're going to learn these really, really well, aren't we? Those endings are nothing, sigma, iota, men, te, nsi. And they connect with a connecting vowel, and you end up with o, ace, a, amen, eta, usi with a new movable. And then attached to luo, you have luo, lues, lue, luamen, luete, lu, usi. Now remember how I said there's two charts you're going to have to learn for the verbal system. The first is the personal ending chart, the master personal ending chart. The second chart I call the master verb chart. Okay, this is the second chart you have to know, and you have to know it absolutely perfectly. If you don't want to learn this chart, then you have to go memorize all 950 forms in the paradigms, okay? This is the chart that's the key to helping you know how to identify the triggers to be able to parse the different verbal forms properly. In every chapter, I'm going to introduce you another 1 or 2 lines in this chart. And the whole chart is in the appendix, but it's a little frightening in the appendix because it takes up a full page. So at least there you can see where you're headed. But in every chapter, we're just going to give you a couple more lines to it, okay? Now here it is. Let me walk through the different columns. In the left-hand column, I'm going to start by specifying tense. And then aug redupe is something we'll talk about in a couple chapters. And then what tense stem is used. Tense form is something we'll look at later on. Then we have connecting vowel. Then we have the personal endings. And then we have the first person singular paradigmatic form. So what you've learned in this chapter is how do I form the present active form of a verb? Well, you form it with the present tense stem, with the connecting vowel, and primary active personal endings. And so you end up with a form like luo. See how it works? Okay, that chart is really important, you all. And you need to memorize it exactly. Again, because it'll show you the triggers that you will use to identify the different inflected forms in the biblical text. So it's a there are some things that you don't have to know in Greek to be able to translate it. This isn't one of them. This is a chart that you simply have to know, okay? Okay, there's going to be a few things different in vocabulary, and let me just, because there's more verbs, and so let me specify let me give you some information about verbs. In a verb, I'm going to give you a lexical form. The lexical form for verbs is the present indicative. So for Lego, it's Lego, okay? I say. So I'm going to give you the lexical form. I'm going to give you the definition. And then in parentheses, I give you the number of times it occurs in the New Testament, and that's just there for encouragement. And then there's going to be an asterisk and what you now know as the present tense stem. That technically is the root, and I'm going to make that differentiation in a few chapters, but that's the present tense stem. That's the root of the verb. And you need to memorize all of those. I mean, you don't have to memorize the frequency, but you need to know the lexical form, the present indicative, Lego. You need to know the definition, and then you need to know that present stem. Underneath the verbs, there's another line of different forms of the Greek verbs. Okay, those are the forms of the Greek verbs in their different tenses. So if you're making your own vocabulary cards, make sure you write those forms out as you write out the cards, but ignore them for the time being. It's going to take 5 or 6 chapters for me to teach you what each of those forms mean, but it's good to get them written down there. But don't let them upset you, okay? All right. Okay, so with no further ado, let's learn the vocabulary from this chapter. Akuo. I hear, learn, obey, understand. Blepo. I see, look at. Echo. I have, hold. Luo. I loose, untie, destroy. Namos, namu, ha. Law, principle. Hapu. Where. Pistuo. I believe, have faith in, trust. Prosopon, prosopu, ta. Face, appearance. Tate. Then, thereafter. Teflas, tefle, teflon. Blind. Chara, charas, hey. Joy, delight.